Let us pray. Holy and amazing God, you have taught us for years. Open our ears and minds to hear your teaching today, that we may respond with grace and joy and bring your teaching to those in our lives. Amen. So our Bible readings today are about love and compassion. So what does that have to do with bugs? As we heard in the kids' message in the book of Proverbs, we're reminded how ants work together to store up food for the winter. Well, that whole working together thing, well, that kind of depends on some love and compassion. And sometimes it is hard to find that love and compassion in our daily lives. Now, I don't know about you. There are some beautiful insects. I like the fireflies. I like the butterflies. But there are other insects that have really bothered me over the years. When I was a kid, I was deathly afraid of bees. Now, I had never been stung by a bee, but if a bee was around and flying around, I got so anxious, I would stop breathing, and I would pass out. This really bothered my mother for quite a while. Later, as a parent, I went out in the front yard. One of my sons was mowing the yard, and I heard screaming. And I ran out, and he was dancing all over the yard. He'd gone over one of those like round hornet nests, and there were several flying around. And of course, he was screaming, and he was dancing, and he was, flailing around, which just agitated whatever these flying, stinging insects were more and more. And so I grabbed him, and I just tried to breathe. I said, "They're going to calm down if we calm down. Please just calm down." And he kept going like this, and he flicked one of them right up my nose. I decided I didn't need to help him anymore at that point, and I walked away before I said something I shouldn't say, which I do believe our Bible's readings today had something about the words that come out of us. And then when I was pregnant, I came down from upstairs. We were living on the family farm in Indiana. It was an old house. It was not in great shape. I came down, and I noticed there were some insects with wings coming in around the door from the porch into the kitchen. And I'd never seen bugs like this. And so I opened the door onto the porch, and there were hundreds of them. Turns out we had termites. And termites swarm at one point during the year, I discovered, and they all decided to swarm into my house that day, and I learned new things about insects that day. I also made my husband go fix the porch and call the Orkin man, or Terminix, whoever, someone like that. So I have not always had positive interactions with bugs in my life, and it makes me think about these bugs as irritants, and how do I respond in these situations, and do I respond with grace or not? And that makes me think about the other irritants in my life, and how do I respond when other things start to bug me? So I thought about this passage from 1 Corinthians, and as a pastor, it's frequently requested as a reading at weddings, and it has often made me wonder about these couples that they feel that they need this passage at the beginning of their relationship to remember to treat each other with patience and love and kindness. But I've also come to realize that this is a passage that many of us only hear at weddings, and we forget that it applies to all of us at all times. The gospel reading from Matthew, depending on your translation, it either comes across as you need to forgive 77 times, or it's 7 times 70, which would be 490. Essentially, we need to have unending forgiveness for the people in our lives. And I wonder about the person who asked this question of Jesus. Just how often do I have to forgive someone, I have to wonder, what were they hoping the answer was going to be? You only have to forgive once, and if they make another mistake or hurt you again, you're off the hook. You could just walk away, and you don't need to remain in relationship with this person. What were they thinking and hoping for? But I think from the reading, they were surprised that the answer was, there is no end to forgiveness. There is always more forgiveness that we can offer because God is always forgiving us. And I think this is something we often forget about relationships. If we are in relationship with anyone, there always needs to be more forgiveness. We certainly need it in these relationships, and we need to offer it. One time I was reading a book about a woman who volunteered in a thrift store. And one day, it was a Catholic thrift store, and one day a woman had come in, and they had one of those little displays where they have the little cards for the saints that you often find at Catholic churches. And this woman was very carefully going through and picking out a few cards, and the volunteer came up and said, "So how are you doing? And how are things in your life?" And she says, "I was just at the Good Friday service." And she said, "Yeah?" And she says, "I finally learned something that I've struggled with." She says, "I have never been able to forgive my father because he abused me in a horrible way as I was growing up. And it has just been a burden that I cannot forgive him for what he's done." And she says, "But Good Friday, I found the answer." And the volunteer's like, "Well, what happened on Good Friday?" She says, "I went to church and I heard the words of Jesus on the cross. 'Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.' I realized if I can't forgive, I can give it to God, and God will do the forgiving for me." She said, "I feel like I've been released until that point when I get to a point when I can do the forgiving myself." Forgiving is important. And then we get to this reading from Ephesians. I know it was a little bit of a long reading, but man, doesn't it just sound like news that we could use today? Instructions that are relevant to our lives. Now, if you stop by my office, people have sometimes shared memes with me, and I've taped them up on my office door, and I've got one that someone sent me, and it said, "If Paul were alive today, we'd be getting a letter." But I think this passage from Ephesians is just as relevant for us and our culture and our struggles today as it was for this church in Ephesus. Because Ephesus was a community, it was a big community, it was a diverse community, it was a big shipping area, and it was people from different cultures, people from different religious backgrounds who had come to hear the good news of Jesus, people of different income levels. And they were having a hard time all getting together and getting along, which sounds a lot like our communities, our nation today, our world today. How do we get along? Paul reminds us we are supposed to actually change when we accept Jesus' invitation to follow him. Jesus wants us to be different, not to just keep going along because, hey, I got my get out of hell free card from believing in Jesus. Jesus is like, no, I want you to become like me. I want you to live with love and compassion and forgiveness for each other. You are to be transformed through my love and my grace. So here we read about how our faith is to become action. Our faith means our behavior changes, our choices change, and we do different things. We work together. We stop lying. We deal with our anger. We say kind words. I don't know about you, but I was just reading this morning as I was scrolling while I was drinking my morning tea, and someone's like, are people ever going to be polite to each other again? When did we lose that sense of politeness in our communities? Say kind words, be kind, be compassionate, be forgiving. When I think about those ants who work together to store up food for the winter, They have to work together. Now, we may not all be working together to store up food, although there have been times we do work together. If you remember Joseph, he got the Egyptians to store up 7 years of food that got a whole lot of people, including Joseph's family who came over from Israel, through a great famine. We don't often think about it, but our governments store up food for us. A group of us was at the Hunger Task Force 2 weeks ago, packing up food that's paid for by the U.S. government to go out to senior citizens who need a little more food to get through each month. We don't see it the same way, but we are still working together through our tax dollars and through our governments to help people get through whatever they are facing. Are we living like those ants and working together, figuring out ways to get along and get the work done? Now, as I mentioned with the kids, one of the ways that I have learned to be transformed is through regular Bible reading. And I read every day with my kids. We went through about 4 or 5 Bibles as they were getting older. We would finish one and switch to a little bit more comprehensive Bible as they aged. But this is one of the spiritual practices that has been one of the methods of Methodism, is that we read the Bible in study groups and personally at home. We store up grace in ourselves through the sacraments of baptism and Holy Communion. We serve others. We give of our time and our money. We meditate to be in God's presence. I watched a movie called Shadowlands once about C.S. Lewis. He fell in love and got married later in his life, and his wife ended up shortly after their marriage having bone cancer and died pretty quickly. And as he was grieving, he went to work one day, and one of his colleagues is like, "So, how are things going?" And he kind of fell apart. C.S. Lewis, he starts crying, and he is clearly overcome by this grief that comes from this late in life joy that he had found. And his friend's like, "Well, we'll keep praying for you." Now, how often do we say this and we just sound a little insecure? And C.S. Lewis is like, the prayer doesn't ever change God, but it changes me. So I am going to keep praying through this because I need to be changed by God in order to deal with this grief. Prayer is one of the spiritual practices that helps us stay focused on others. We listen to God. We lift up the needs of our neighbors. We stop thinking only about ourselves. Sometimes I'm a little sad about some of the Christian traditions that we've kind of let go of over time. The Muslim friends that I have, they pray 5 times a day. Christians for hundreds and hundreds of years had a practice of praying 3 or 4 times a day. These days, we pretty much only think about monks and nuns doing that, but it used to be every Christian prayed when they got up, they prayed at lunch, they prayed at the end of their workday, and they prayed when they went to bed. I won't ask for a show of hands of how many of us are doing that. But I wonder, would we be transformed? These weren't big, huge, long prayers. Some people had little prayer books in the Middle Ages. They were beautifully decorated. They just opened it up and they'd say a little prayer and they'd move on. It wasn't a long thing, but there was a constant taking a moment multiple times during the day to think about someone else and to receive God's grace so that we're ready to deal with whatever the people around us are dealing with. When I went to pastor licensing school, sometimes called pastor boot camp when I first became a pastor, it was in South Dakota. And we were required to read a book called Dakota, written by a spiritual author named Kathleen Norris. And it's a beautiful book about her moving from New York City to the Dakotas and some of the cultural differences she found between the two communities. But she spent some time at a Benedictine monastery. And monks in a monastery have to live together all the time. like ants in a colony. They can't ever get away from people. They're not going to move away. They're not going to run out and, go away for the weekend and get a break. They are always together, morning, noon, and night. And as she watched the monks, she discovered how they dealt with the irritants of community life. And she discovered it because she would go talk to them because she's like, I just saw you with, brother so-and-so in the hallway. And it looked like things got a little tense. But you guys didn't say mean words to each other. Like, how do you deal with that? And they said, they pray every time they see someone that they have been irritated by. They find something kind to do every day for someone who annoys them. They stop thinking about what's irritating them, and as soon as that thought comes to their mind, they're like, nope, I'm going to think about something that brings me grace. And they just stop thinking about it. Not instantly, but every time they switch to grace, the irritation becomes less. Now, I don't know about you, when I look at the world today, it seems like there's more and more political instability. It seems that lots of communities are struggling. Even places that used to get along pretty well seem to be struggling. Great Britain has a new prime minister. As I was growing up, prime ministers served for years and years in Great Britain, and what is it, 7 and 10 months or something that they've had now? That used to be Italy when I was younger. It seems like Italy has more stability in their prime minister leaders. Things are changing. People are frustrated. There are some very real problems that we're facing in the world, and we're not sure how to deal with each other to find compromise and work through these problems. So I want to lift up these Bible readings today as instruction to remind us to live from a place of compassion and grace, to keep finding one more time to forgive the people around us, to pray for the spiritual gift of patience, that we will be willing to keep talking and building the relationships with the people around us. And I have to admit, sometimes there are people who hurt us in a way that we do need to walk away. But maybe we can learn something from those monks where we can continue praying for them and finding ways to be kind to them. I met a guy named Tim once. He was a volunteer at a drop-in coffee shop for people without shelter that I was also volunteering with. And it was nice that this church had opened up their basement for people to come and get coffee and some snacks. But somehow, someone always left a door open. So there were always flies buzzing around. And it just takes one fly, and it can get really irritating. I mean, sometimes one fly is even worse than having 10 or 15 in the room. But Tim had a fly swatter. And his gift to the community was he took care of every fly that came in. It was a tiny, small thing, but he was dealing with something that was getting on the nerves of everyone else there. He found a small way to make a difference and improve the quality of life for everyone. The other thing about the things that bug us is that sometimes it's not small stuff like one fly buzzing around a coffee area. But sometimes there are really big things that bug us, really big things that are causing terrific harm in the world. Mosquitoes have brought Zika, malaria, many other diseases to people through the years. Right now, there are other types of bugs that we can't see. A nurse friend of mine talked about those bugs of COVID and measles, of MRSA and staph. Bugs that we usually call germs, bacteria and viruses that we know from personal experience have changed the world in recent years. I was reminded that before COVID, the Wisconsin Conference of the United Methodist Church, we raised over $1 million as part of the Imagine No Malaria campaign. And working with the NBA, working with other United Methodists around the world, we actually dramatically reduced the number of cases of malaria in Africa through our efforts. We worked together. We put some energy in. We transformed ourselves. We changed our behavior. We did something we didn't think we could do. United Methodists in Wisconsin raising $1 million? That's crazy. Just like those ants finding enough food to get through the winter after the grasshoppers took it all. It was crazy, but we did it. We came together and we did it. We worked together to come up with vaccines for COVID. We have vaccines for measles, but we stopped working together to remind people of how well our vaccines work and how important they are for our communities. We need to remember we still need to work together to raise money, to raise awareness, to educate people on prevention. We need to set goals with measurable results, hold ourselves accountable for making our community a healthy place for everyone. As we are struggling with these difficult times right now, I've been reading some books about other communities that have had really disruptive political changes in their country's history. And what did they do when it was over? What happens next? When the war is over, when a leader leaves, what happens afterwards in those communities? And I was reading some stories from Germany after World War II. How did Germany rebuild? And there are a couple things I'd like to offer you today to think about in light of our Ephesians reading of being kind to each other and patient with each other. One of the things that really helped was people found the thing that they could do. So there was a group of housewives who figured out the thing they could do was host the witnesses who needed to tell their stories at the Nuremberg trials. They had just a network of housewives that would call each other, email each other, and say, hey, I've got someone coming into town. Do you have an extra bed? Will you make sure they're fed? Will you walk with them to the courthouse to make sure they get there? There was no organization. There was no logo. There was no bylaws. It was just people who were like, we can do this thing together to make sure the story is heard of what happened. Another thing that was really powerful was that when someone came up and said, you know, I voted for Hitler because I thought he would be good for our country and for my family, but I've changed my mind. And what they discovered is if you said, well, thanks for showing up. This is what we're doing right now to rebuild our community. We'd love for you to work with us. There was no, what were you thinking? There was no, really? It's taken you this long? There was no shaming. There was no questioning. There was just kindness. I'm glad you're here. And there was welcome. Do you want to work with us? What are we going to do when what we are going through right now turns into something else? Because a lot of us have found that there are some people it's hard to talk to right now. But they're still going to be our neighbors. A year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we're still going to be in community together. What do we do? Are we willing to let Jesus transform us? Are we willing to be different? Are we willing to be kind to people we might also need to forgive? I met a pastor from, at the time, the most diverse racially and economically church in the United Methodist connection. He was from an area outside Cleveland, Ohio. And he said one of the things that their church had found really useful to live together as a very diverse congregation, they had something they called the 70-30 rule. We get along and we agree on about 70% of the stuff, but we know the other 30% is important to the person sitting next to us. Now, maybe it's a hot button issue like our position on abortion or human sexuality and gender. Maybe it's just which songs are we singing on Sunday morning? There are many different ways we are different from each other, and John Wesley, who got the Methodist movement going in the 1700s, said similar things. We may not think alike, but cannot we love alike? We don't have to agree on everything. But it seems like right now, there are certain groups in the world that are trying to make their group perfect. We perfectly align on all of these issues or all of whatever their thing is. We're all the same. But God didn't make us all the same. How can we embrace the 70% we agree on and be patient with the 30%? I heard once about two older guys, retirees, and they ran into each other at the coffee table at church. And the one guy said, I haven't seen you for a while, to the other guy. And the other guy's like, yeah, I know, I've been going to the late service. And the first guy's like, you hate the late service. They play all that modern music. They've got drums and guitars. You hate that. Come with me to the organ and the hymns. I know you love them. He's like, yeah, but my granddaughter likes the late service music. And it's more important for me to have my granddaughter here than to have the music I prefer. When are we willing to identify the things that irritate us and start setting them aside and finding a place of grace and kindness in our lives? One last thing, this morning as I was reading the news, I came across a story from this last week involving President Obama. And he loves basketball. You know, he had a basketball hoop, little gym built at the White House, and he got to hang out with some WNBA players this week, including Caitlin Clark. And there was a bit of a hot mic moment, and he had some words of advice for Caitlin Clark, and they were captured, and you can go online and find out what he said. But she was interviewed afterwards about this, and she said, you know what? He told me to treat people with respect, treat people with grace, and to stay focused on my game. She's someone who's come to fame very early in life. She's in a sports league that is growing, but has a lot of tension about pay equity, about race, how some people are treated differently than others, who the referees call out for fouls and who they don't. She has a lot of irritants that could potentially throw her off her game. And from what I understand, I'm not a big basketball fan. There are times when she plays when you can see she's irritated, evidently. It is hard to be in that place. What do we do with the irritations in our lives when we are bugged? Do we respond with respect and grace? Or do we let it eat away at us? So as we go forth this week, let us go and put in the effort and energy of love and compassion to make a difference in the world and to stay focused on the job that God has given us as a community. How about let's be busy as bees and work like we've got ants in our pants? Amen.